Hey guys, how's it going? This channel's usually about gaming, but I thought today I'd do something a little bit different and talk about my other area of interest, ancient history, specifically Alexander the Great. Alexander was, as many of you know, a Macedonian king and conqueror who conquered the Persian Empire, died at the age of 33, and his empire collapsed around him, but is generally regarded as one of the great figures of ancient history. I did my master's dissertation on Alexander and his father Philip, and so I thought, just for a bit of fun, I would share some of my knowledge with you all in the form of an instructional video. Now, like a real historian, I'm going to start the video with what all historical discussions start with, which is a discussion of the sources. How do we know what we know about Alexander? Well, in his case, we only actually have secondary or arguably tertiary sources. That is, work that was not written at the time, but is based on afterthought, if you like. They come from the works of Arrian, Rufus, Plutarch, and Diodorus. All of these were Roman authors, and as such they were writing several hundred years after Alexander's death. But what makes them interesting and what makes them valuable is that they all had access to primary sources written at the time by people witnessing the events, which we now do not. Chiefly these came from Nearchus, Ptolemy, Aristobulus, and Clitarchus. Nearchus and Aristobulus both accompanied Alexander on his journeys, and they both had at least a small part to play in his campaign. It's not known exactly how or in what capacity Nearchus was influencing him, but Aristobulus was certainly one of his retainers and quite possibly a kind of unofficial historian for him, which makes him, in a way, useful, because he obviously was as close to Alexander as anybody, so he knew more than anyone what Alexander was really like. But by contrast, he would also not write anything that Alexander himself would disapprove of, and so his information is probably slightly skewed as a result. But both of them are valuable. Ptolemy is probably the best of the four, because he was actually a general in Alexander's army. He fought alongside Alexander and his father Philip for most of their lives, and actually outlived Alexander to become the king of what is now Egypt, although at the time it was nicknamed after him, the Ptolemaic Empire. He is generally regarded as the best source on Alexander. He wrote extensive memoirs of his campaigns whilst governing over Egypt. He actually was also the ancestor of Cleopatra, and his generations lasted right up until the middle of the Roman Empire. Just as a side note, not really relevant, but interesting. It's also why Cleopatra and others are represented tend to be a lot more Greek-looking than Northern African, because they were Greek and not North African. He's been questioned by a number of people for potentially trying to gloss over some of his own part in some of the negative parts of the story, and trying to glorify himself, but there's very little to support that this was the case, and most of the sources in question, that is the Roman authors whose word we're taking for all of this, considered him to be really factual and quite well balanced, all in all. Clitarchus is unique in that he did not write narrative history, but he actually recorded interviews with the soldiers who fought in Alexander's armies, and kind of presented them as a compendium of opinions on Alexander. He's one that we would most like to have if we could pick any of them, because it's very rare that grassroots history, as it's known, was even considered to be relevant at the time. Most history up until really the 20th century was the works of great men, if you like, and their retainers. It was Alexander and the people around him writing about Alexander and the people around him. There are examples, like Clitarchus, of low-level history, people who weren't in themselves well recorded or well regarded in the historical sense, but who clearly their experiences were just as valid and just as interesting as the great men of history. Unfortunately, that is lost to us, but several of the Roman authors did have access to it, which means that some of it probably is in there. Callisthenes also was one who Ptolemy based a lot of his work on. He was the official historian, if you like, of Alexander. Alexander, being far away from Macedon for most of his life, relied on others to pass on tales of his doings and his deeds back in his home country. And Callisthenes was one of the main individuals tasked with doing this. Ptolemy used a lot of his work, which was obviously geared towards presenting Alexander in as positive a light as possible. But again, that in itself isn't irrelevant. Between them then, those 5 ancient sources, if you include Callisthenes, built up the works of Arrian, Plutarch, Rufus and Diodorus. As a brief guide, Arrian is the most useful. His is the most complete and the most varied in his approach to Alexander. He also doesn't deliberately try to present him as good or bad. In fact, he mentions in the opening of his work that he himself doesn't believe a lot of what he's written, but it was what was recorded by the sources he had, and so he felt compelled to include them and allow the reader to make up their own mind about what really happened. One of the better ancient historians, it has to be said. Plutarch and Diodorus are both good. Both of them wrote life histories of him. Plutarch's Lives series are very well known, one of the best sources that we have on any ancient historical figure. He wrote it on a great number of individuals, and a lawful lot of ancient history is based on his work. Both of them are good. Rufus is probably the most entertaining read. If you just want to know Alexander's life in a way that's compelling, Rufus is probably the best. He's a little light on details compared to Arrian, but obviously still very useful to read. Most of them read kind of like different translations of the same novel, if you like. Some of them include bits that others don't, some of them drop bits that others don't, some of them represent certain sections of the story in a different light or from a different angle. But fundamentally, the ones that they all include are most probably the ones that are the most reliable. There are a couple of individual odd stories that you'll find that clearly even the Roman authors didn't believe. There's a particular example of Alexander being taken to a tribe of Amazons whilst in the Persian territories, in which the leader of the Amazonian tribe found him so impossibly attractive that she insisted he take her there and then so that she could bear the strongest children she ever could. This is most probably not true, but weirdly it probably came from the grassroots stories rather than from Alexander himself. That's the kind of story that would be spread around a lot of the soldiers you can imagine. And even if those stories aren't true, they give you a kind of a deeper truth about Alexander, which is what the impression that he left on the world and on the people that he interacted with. Even if the Roman authors don't believe them, and even if the original sources writing it didn't really believe them, it tells you what everybody thought of Alexander, that they could put their name to a piece of writing that included that story and expect it to be taken seriously. That Alexander could be portrayed in that way comfortably by everybody that seemed to write about him. It tells you a lot about how highly regarded he was, and in what way they considered him to be an exceptional individual. So that's essentially the source of the information we have. All of it's worth reading, all of it's available in paper form, in hardcover, in digital books, on Google Books, on Apple Books, on all kinds of sources. If you want to read any of them, I would advise you to, because it's well worth and it's very interesting. It's strange to say it, but it's a better epic novel than most actual epic novels, is the history of Alexander. And so I think you'll enjoy them. The story of Alexander actually begins a few decades before he was born, when the Greek peninsula was still in the midst of war. As most of you probably know if you know anything about ancient history, there was no unified Greek nation for most of its history, and individual city-states battled each other for supremacy in an almost perpetual state of war. Sparta had been the dominant power since their victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, but since then had gone into decline and were eventually defeated by Thebes, who supplanted them as the dominant power in the Greek peninsula. This is important because this happened long before Alexander was born, but one of the tribes who had fought against Thebes in those series of wars was a small northern barbarian tribe known as Macedon. And as a consequence of Macedon's defeat to Thebes, one of their young princes was given as a ward to the Thebans. Imagine Theon Greyjoy living with the Starks because they defeated the Greyjoys, and so they keep their son as a kind of hostage insurance policy that they won't start anything again. That prince was a young boy named Philip, and while he was with the Thebans, he was given a proper military upbringing. He learned everything he knew about the military tactics and the kind of modern standing army that most states, even in ancient Greece, didn't have. Epaminondas was his official caretaker, and he was considered to be the best military mind of the age. He raised him like his own son, and supposedly their relationship was very close. Upon reaching adulthood, Philip returned to Macedonia, and with the then king's permission, his father began reorganising the army in accordance with what he had learned during his decade or so with the Thebans. Shortly afterwards, about several years after he started reorganising the army, it had become a proper organised military force. He had created a heavy cavalry brigade, which he called the Companion Cavalry, and had organised the infantry into the phalanx, which most of you will probably know from 300 or other historical films. Soldiers overlapping their shields, creating an impenetrable wall to push and defeat the enemy. This was relatively new in Macedon, and not many people had used it before. Even in Greece, there was only the handful of states who you all probably know off by heart: Corinth, Sparta, Athens, etc., who used those kind of tactics. Philip adapted them to Macedonian ways. He made them heavier. He had heavier shields, heavier armour, longer spears, to try and gain an edge over his rivals, taking what he learned in Thebes and applying it to his own situation. Shortly after he created this army, he began fighting local barbarian tribes, defeating them one after the other, and eventually gained Macedon a position of dominance in the north of Greece. Still too far north for most to consider him a threat, but increasingly he was looking like a problem for the other states. In particular, he seized a lot of gold and silver mines that existed in the mountains in the north of Greece, which gave him an immense amount of wealth to spend on his army and rebuilding Macedon as a culture, as a civilization, and particularly Philippa as a city. Upon the death of his father, Philip ascended to the throne of Macedon and became known as Philip II. He immediately began his quest for expansion across Greece, first heading west towards the tribes known as the Thracians, which is where he made his name as a threat to the other Greek states, by conquering them one by one and diplomatically subjugating the remainder of them, making him the premier power in the peninsula. It was in these early days of his reign that his son Alexander was born, and perhaps as a reflection of how Macedon was, compared to how it had been when Philip was a boy, Alexander was given a mixture of a traditional Macedonian warrior's upbringing. You can imagine the kind of Gallic or Britannian tribe type upbringing of military discipline, combat training, horse riding, etc., but also with the best possible Greek education that could possibly exist at the time. His father arranged for Aristotle, who many of you may know as the greatest philosopher of the ancient world, to be his personal tutor. Aristotle didn't come cheap. Philip had to rebuild his entire hometown, including buying every former resident out of slavery to convince him to work as Alexander's tutor. Alexander showed himself to be an intelligent pupil and a fantastic warrior, and had a natural grasp of almost everything that they tried to teach him. There's a particular story that tells of a large black horse that Philip's best trainers couldn't break, and so it was due to be slaughtered until Alexander insisted that he be allowed to try. Philip, impressed with the boy's courage, agreed to let him try and told him that if he could in fact tame it, he could keep it. Alexander, of course, tamed it immediately, rode it around the grounds, and when he returned back, decided it would be named Bucephalus. That horse he rode for most of his life up until his campaigns in India, when it was sadly killed. But at this point, Philip was still conquering Greece and Alexander was still undergoing his education. Philip's campaigns lasted for decades, and in over 40 different conflicts. He conquered the Greek states one by one and played them off against each other, always to his benefit. Philip was a fabulous tactician and a master negotiator. He made a lot of enemies along the way, but managed to control large parts of Greece by the time Alexander was 17. Predictably, it was Athens who was his biggest threat. Athens, despite their defeats in the wars and never being a dominant power in Greece for some time, still were the most powerful, in that they controlled most of the trade through Greece, through their enormous navy and quite large empire. Large by comparison with the other Greek states, that is. Not large compared to Persia, for example. Demosthenes, in particular, was the Athenian leader at the time, and he and Philip considered each other to be their natural enemy. It was particularly the gold and silver mines that Philip had seized that threatened the Athenians. Their ability to effectively buy out a lot of other Greek states undermined Athens' ability to do so, and so made Philip a significant threat to them. They also believed, or Demosthenes in particular believed, that Philip was intending to become a dictator over all of Greece, and that given the opportunity he would force them all to be his servants. Demosthenes wasn't far wrong, because that's exactly what Philip was doing through most of his campaign, and so Demosthenes attempted at every possible angle to ally all of Philip's opponents together to try to defeat him. This took place over the course of about 20 years, until the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip conclusively defeated the Athenians and their allies, including, incidentally, Thebes, where he had learned his trade, and he forced them all into a loose alliance with himself as the leader, fulfilling Demosthenes' prophecy. He called this the League of Corinth, and effectively created a Macedonian empire over all the other Greek states. This in itself was a significant moment for Macedon, given where they'd started. They'd been a northern barbarian tribe on the fringe of the Greek political world, with no real influence, used as cannon fodder by the powerful Greek states in their wars with each other. Since Philip had took over, they'd become the supreme power in Greece, the best army in the ancient world that even all the forces of the other Greek states combined couldn't defeat. It cannot be overstated just how significant Philip's contribution was in building Macedon from nothing into a superpower in the ancient world. The biggest reflection of this came shortly after the establishment of the League of Corinth, when Philip announced that his next campaign would be the invasion of Asia Minor and the eventual conquest of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire spanned all the way from India to modern-day Turkey. It was the largest empire in the ancient world. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. And it had long attempted to conquer Greece. As many of you will know, multiple invasion attempts, such as the one depicted in the film 300, when the Spartans defeated them first at Thermopylae and then at Plataea. Often the Greek states were afraid of Persia, and many lived in fear, but many of them also benefited a lot from conversations with the Persians. Athens in particular traded a huge amount, and so this was a threat to everybody other than Macedon. Unsurprisingly, Philip didn't live to see his designs realised, and he was assassinated during a court meeting within a year of making this proclamation. Some people have speculated that it was Alexander himself who organised Philip's assassination, or at least that his mother, who was not Philip's favourite, had been involved in the planning of it. To be honest, there is no real evidence to support this, and there's no good reason why Alexander would look to do so. In the film Alexander, 2004, starring Colin Farrell, it's portrayed as Alexander's position as Philip's successor being under threat, and so his mother, played by, weirdly, Angelina Jolie, had assassinated Philip in order to secure Alexander's position. This was not the case in ancient Macedon. Alexander was very clearly Philip's natural successor and his favourite, to the point where he'd even served as the commander of the companion cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea against Athens, and effectively Philip's second in command. There was no doubt that can be found that Alexander was Philip's natural successor, which leaves that there are three other possible culprits, one being fellow members of the court, one being Demosthenes and the Athenians, and the third being the Persians. Philip was immensely popular amongst his army and his court. He'd brought them all unprecedented success, wealth and power. There's no good reason to think that anybody within Macedon had any reason to want Philip dead. Conversely, both Athens and Persia clearly had very, very good reasons to want Philip dead. He just the Athenians, after decades of war, into subjugation, and was now telling them their armies would be brought into his to fight an enemy that A, may have been too large for them to defeat and would ultimately spell destruction, and B, they benefited greatly from trading with. Not to mention a lot of the bad blood between Philip and many in the Athenian court. It's fairly obvious that Athens are the prime suspect in his assassination. Persia too, a superpower that had emerged in the Greek peninsula, had forced all of their enemies together into one alliance, had now announced his intention to invade and conquer them. It doesn't take a genius to realise that Persia would want him dead as soon as possible. Unfortunately for both of them, who most likely conspired together to kill Philip, it would be a lot easier for the Persians to assassinate him with Athenian help. Unfortunately for both of them, if their plan was Philip's death to end his plans of conquering the Persian Empire, they were wrong. They in fact replaced him with somebody every bit as ambitious, probably more so, Alexander, who had no intention of abandoning the plans to invade Persia. And the moment he'd completed his father's funeral, the next day he set off for the ships to invade. That's really the beginning of Alexander's story when he takes the throne of Macedonia, but you can see that there is a lot of build-up to it that really... It puts a different light in Alexander, who is portrayed in a lot of historical literature as a genius, wonder kid, something more than human that took a tiny army and conquered the entire world off nothing. Really, there was an awful lot of build-up done by Philip, a lot of good work done. That Alexander inherited the strongest army in the world. He invaded Persia knowing that his homeland was secure, conquered, that there were no internal enemies in the immediate area. He had a vast fortune with which to buy mercenaries and equipment and ships, anything he needed, because of the silver and gold mines that Philip had secured for him. Of course, there were still enemies in there. He still had internal enemies, but Philip had also left him a fairly clear line of succession, and there were no challengers to speak of to Alexander's reign. One or two in the early days, but they disappeared within a week of Philip's death. He also left him with an extremely professional military council. Ptolemy, obviously, Parmenion another, extremely well-trained, experienced generals who had decades of warfare under the belt who could advise him. Alexander did not do it on his own, and clearly his victories stemmed back from before Philip was born in the conquest of Greece by first Sparta and then Thebes. They developed the military tactics, which Philip was then given almost by accident as a result of being defeated by the Thebans, but which he then took on, improved upon, and forced all of the Greek states into an alliance that they'd never had before. There's a very good argument to be made that Philip was in fact a better king and a better conqueror than Alexander, which in fact was the subject of my dissertation, if anybody's interested. Philip was clearly an incredible king. The difference being between him and Alexander that Philip was probably more intelligent than Alexander. He thought ahead beyond just how to win the next battle, but how to use the next battle and how to hold on to the next victory that he achieved. Philip, after every war that he fought, had more afterwards than he had started with. He always had a new ally or a new kingdom or a new silver mine, a new army, a new mercenary group. Something that he could then use in his next battle. And as I said, he left Alexander with a position in Greek politics that no one could have possibly imagined even Athens or Thebes having a few decades earlier, let alone Macedon. Alexander conquered far more. He was in fact more effective and more successful in battle than Philip. We'll get into that in the next video when I discuss Alexander's actual life and conquests, but he never lost a battle in his career. Philip obviously did. Philip fought a lot more battles than Alexander. But more crucially, Philip left his successor with a superpower of a country and an invincible army. Alexander, within a year after his death, not only his empire, but the empire Philip had built fell apart into nothing. All of his territories were ruled by his generals. Greek states largely went back to governing themselves. Macedon became just another kingdom in the north of Greece. As important as it is to point out all the success that Alexander had and the great effect he had on wider human history, in the immediate effect of his own kingdom, Alexander actually, in the long run, undid all of Philip's good work rather than build upon it. So there's a good argument to be made, and many do now in a kind of hipster way. It's common in academia to challenge assumptions, even if those assumptions are self-evidently true. That there's a growing opinion that Philip was in fact more worthy of being called the Great than Alexander was. But regardless of that, Philip died and Alexander took his throne, and then took his mantle as the invader of Persia. That's all for this video. That's the origins of Alexander. That's how we know what we know about him and how he got to where he was. In the next video we'll talk about what Alexander did with the legacy that Philip left him. And then hopefully in a video after, the legacy that he left on the world generally. That's all for now, guys. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.